Ah, Madonna, che palle, non si dice. No.
Do you have a PowerPoint or PowerPoint?
Are you ready to?
Should I go first or?
Are you ready to?
Okay. I didn't know.
Okay,
I'm
you don't want to go first.
No, I read it.
Okay, well, in that case, I really hate host and Sean.
I'm sure going to.
Yeah, I can. So, so we do, we put down those plates. So, download arms to go. There is someone else as well.
Yeah.
The GA is comment was.
Actually, also asked it.
Okay, that's a very, that's good.
Said questions.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we do 15 minutes because we won't be able to do 20 with this many hours. And it's basically it's a season of that. And you're UK discussion. So yeah, and the yeah, maybe just is Habib online at the moment, do you know?
What?
Habib Sani is the
Yeah, he's up.
okay. Habib, if you can hear me, you're going to speak fourth after the three panelists that you can see on the screen. And we may have a fifth panelist coming later on in the session. So we're going to speak for 15 minutes.
Hello.
Okay. Or maybe if you could just type in chat to panelist 15, these going for panelist 50 about the missing.
So he's going fourth and.
Habib is going, yeah, it's
how
going
many
for
minutes?
15 minutes. Thank you very much. Hello, so welcome this morning. Thank you for turning up at 8 o'clock in the morning to hear about new legal and political histories of Lagos. So I'm Oliver Coates, the chair of the panel that's sponsored by the Lagos Studies Association, headed by Professor Adriano, you can see in the back row. And today we're going to hear papers by, first of all, Susan Salon of Princeton, who will talk about a shared struggle in Nigeria, Biafra War, and African Americans in the age of decolonization. And then we have Anila Soyemi of Oxford University, who will speak about laws, moral legitimacy, historical participation, and the case of general jurisprudence. Then we have Halima Sumatan of Georgetown, who will speak on colonial cities after empire, grassroots activists, and the politics of governing Lagos, Nigeria. Then we will have Habib Sani of Lagos State University and Shakira Sani of Eka University of Medicine and Health Science, who will speak about indigent settlers, conundrum of the 2023 general elections in Lagos State and historical perspective. And finally, we hope to also have Damilola Adebayo of York University, who will speak about dying in the service of empire, the politics of compassionate gratuity in the Nigerian civil service from 1900 to 1960. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Susan for the first paper.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming and coordination of this item. As already mentioned, as you can say, at my talk title is a shared struggle. The Nigerian program that we of the transition. The turbulence of Africa's post-colonial history from the late 1950s and the early 1960s provides the backdrop of story and talk. And we find evidence of this turbulence in the onset of the Nigerian program, or the Nigerian Civil War as it's famous now. But the story of the Nigerian program has been very well documented. from eyewitness accounts of Chairman Frederick Forsyth, John St. George, and Enoch, which led to Russell story and possible afternoon, as a narrative and response. We read very differing views about the leading factors of intermediate groups that contributed to the outcome of the story alongside its progression, how the war was fought when it began in 1967, so it ends in 1970. And although the opinions of scholars might diverge or even converge, one central element of the conflict's cause has been linked to the rabbits of oil.
Hello, good afternoon. Have a good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Habib. We can hear you. Please check the chat box. Thank you.
I heard the debates that remain most of this, I've been able to very open this tonight. I am not going to talk about the cause of the Nigerian people of the trust that is its privilege. I shall instead turn our attention to the transnational aspect of the conflict, which brought to the fore series of interactions between African Americans in the United States and notable actors of the Civil War. As this dimension is perhaps the most mistaken in historiography, African Civil War. And so my presentation focuses on how the African American later in this conflict, as it finished on 1967 and 1970, viewing it as a shared struggle against domination and oppression. And African Americans engaged in solidarities with African nations who had faced not exactly but similar situations and the legacy of complex and colonialism as well as systemic effects of racism, poverty, and marginalization. Many African Americans viewed Nigeria's civil war as an interracial field instigated by white neocolonial agents, rather than as a consequence of long-standing ethnic, cultural, and regional antagonism. And I think that it is right here that we find one of the deepest connections between African Americans and Nigeria. African Americans in the United States were in some ways contending with civil rights concerns, which had been intensified during the 1950s and 1960s. Racial minorities, including African Americans, activists, and earlier elaborated on the story of internal colonialism, especially in the late 1950s. And they had employed this idea as a way to explain their subordinate status and the racial and residential segregation that they were experiencing, as well as the American politics that was so prevalent in the United States. And so the fights to freedom in colonial Africa and the eventual civil wars and secession struggles that took place in the case of post-colonial Nigeria, and African Americans' century-long struggles with civil liberties and racial equality in some ways mirrored each other. These struggles were looked at through the lens of the deep-rooted legacies of colonization and colonialism, and this reinforced in some ways active solidarity and interactions between African Americans in the United States and several African nations. Freedom and self-determination and the ways to achieve them would therefore constitute different things to many civil rights movements and advocates and other political commentators in the African American community at the time. So what would freedom look like as Nigeria remained united or disintegrated as Biafra had now seceded? Consequently, as the Nigeria-Biafra war reached on, a crucial but very contrasted set of opinions have begun to form in the African American community. African American advocates for an independent Biafra view the struggle as an invalidation of political rule that had created conditions of subordination for its subjects, in some ways an extension of the relics of colonial rule. Partisans of an integrated Nigeria, on the other hand, saw that the war required unwarranted external intervention and dependence. And so they considered the relocation of this affiliated region of Biafra into the Nigerian government as analogous to resisting neo-colonial domination and interference, and ultimately restoring the unity of Africa as a whole. These diametrically opposed viewpoints became representative of the outlooks and the politically engaged African American community from the mid-1960s. In the case of Nigeria, it was a newly emancipated nation state, and it was perceived as a model of Black freedom and self-government for many African Americans at the time. Other African nations like Congo had fallen into civil war from the early 1960s. Ghana was gradually drifting towards authoritarianism, and there were other territorial conflicts in Africa at the time. Here now in 1967, Nigeria was also the brink of a fratricidal conflict, and issues of liberation and self-government was again at the center of things. Colonial control, regardless of whatever form of facade it appropriated, was very well perceived by the African American community by virtue of their own struggle against subjugation and domination as leading a nationalist movement for liberation. But then, as the historian Benjamin Talton tells us, Black solidarity based on shared struggle was bound to experience tensions and debates, especially when national boundaries are involved, and like Africans and those in diaspora articulated African unity very differently. The opinions of African Americans regarding the present state and future of Nigeria were very motivating. In fact, we find one of the starkest illustrations of this non-uniformity of thought in African American newspapers of the period. Black political figures, civil rights leaders, newspaper correspondents, journalists, and other African American observers utilized the editorial pages of Black press as a space to expound on and articulate competing viewpoints regarding the political stability in Nigeria, its effects on African unity, and its connections to their own struggles in the United States and vice versa. A representation of such conflictual perspectives among key African American figures was between Black Power activist, lawyer, and former national director of the Congress of Racial Equality, Floyd McKissick, and Congressman Charles Diggs, who in 1968 went head-to-head about whether Nigeria should be united or whether Biafra was free to establish an independent state. And so in 1968, McKissick published a 5-part series in the New York Amsterdam News, where he accredited Biafra's breakaway from the Nigerian state and recognized its sovereignty as a state and nation. And one of his very notable expressions read, quote, "Africa needs unity, but the general consent of all people involved is the only basis on which unity can be maintained or extended." On the other side of the coin, Congressman Charles Diggs' opinion stood in direct opposition to that of McKissick. In fact, for Diggs, Nigerian unity and the reintegration of the secessionist state of Biafra, who he always referred to as the rebel state, into the Nigerian government was parallel to the unity of Africa. In an interview with newsmen at the United States Information Services Headquarters in Lagos, Diggs had blasted African American political figures like McKissick, who dared to endorse the right of Biafrans to break away from the federal government of Nigeria. And in fact, he made his stance very clear that the one Nigerian concept that serves Africa. So in direct contrast to McKissick's urgings for greater autonomy and recognition of the state of Biafra as one fundamental illustration of Africa's liberation, Diggs, on the other hand, saw Biafra as a dying cause and vehemently maintained the position that the world elected with sovereignty of Nigeria still intact. And another aspect of African Americans' engagement with the Nigerian took the intervention of a more structured association through which they could lobby on behalf of African forces. And one such association was the American Negro Leadership Conference in Africa, better known as the ANLCA. It was originally established in 1962 by Peter Brown, who is a diplomat and also a civil rights activist. And he had earlier engaged in Pan-Africanist endeavors, writing the diplomatic votes to Africa, visiting countries like Ghana, Derek, Nigeria to build diplomatic support. And the Nigeria-Biafra War was exemplified. The Nigeria-Biafra War exemplified the ANLCA's very foremost endeavor in dealing directly with the post-colonial African crisis that was very interconnected to freedom struggles in the United States. In 1967, between June and November, Brown and Ekpa engaged in one fewer than 2 diplomatic visits to Nigeria, each one being outside Biafra, hoping to pave the way for other members of the consolidation committee to visit the region. And they also worked alongside with the OAU to kind of ensure peaceful resolve to the conflict. And members of the ANLCA were very keen on conflict resolution through non-violent means. By the end of 1967, the ANLCA committee comprising four of the most prominent civil rights activists, Roy Wilkins, Philip Randolph, Young, and Martin Luther King Jr., were deeply concerned about the civil war in Nigeria, and they had plans to embark the emergency trip to Nigeria, but Luther King Jr. sudden assassination in 1967 put a huge strain on the ANLCA's mission to African. Gradually, the ANLCA entered into permanent law. There were also blatant ink battle between pro-Biafra African American newspapers and pro-Nigerian African American newspapers. It was so blatant because each had distinct positions about what constituted unity for Africa. So while those supported Nigeria to remain unified, the others insisted that unification only be achieved if Biafra was allowed to be independent and to establish the state. And so many scholars have talked about all of the humanitarian processes and activities that took place within the African American community as a way to show that it went beyond maybe the stressful to it becoming something that's fundamental and often very well discussed in the African American community. So while African Americans were disunited in their standpoints about the future of Nigeria and Biafra, they were united in offering solidarity and humanitarian aid to their Black brothers and sisters, whose travails resulted in a civil war that pitted the Nigerian and Biafra as leading against each other. I think that highlighting all of these connections uncovers the importance and understanding connections between African American civil rights leaders and political commentators at the Nigerian Biafra conflict in the era of civilization. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. We move on to our next speaker.
So this piece always generally employ historical methods, use them for philosophical purposes. So I think most historians would probably find the image weird. But normative political philosophy, in any case, historical methodology is not particularly common, and it's certainly not common in African political philosophy, which is where my work is focused. So my presentation today is on the first chapter of a book my first book, which hopefully will be out at the end of next year with Bloomsbury Publishing. And it is trying to look at what it is that we're missing in our understandings of what makes law authoritative. And my particular concern as a Nigerian, born and raised in the place and understands, like much of the literature in African studies tells us that the law just doesn't function in those kinds of societies. What is it that those kinds of societies are telling us about how we understand law? What is it that the way that we understand law should be telling us about how we understand those kinds of societies? So as a graduate student, I was perplexed to find well-established understandings of legal philosophy that basically tell us nothing about how to understand countries like Nigeria. And in essence, most African and post-colonial societies, almost without exception. And you would either have to decide that there was something wrong with those societies, or there was something wrong with the mentality of the people in those societies that had to be fundamentally changed in order for law to function. On the other side, you have a deep scholarship in critical legal theory that says, well, the problem is a theory, and we need to disband with this understanding that we have. And we just need to focus on how law functions in these specific, peculiar societies and deal with it that way. And what I find, and I don't know if it's just my nature as a generally cantankerous person, so I read very few English, but both sides were missing something from me. Because each of them in their own specific way were treating these societies as special cases that fundamentally couldn't be understood by anybody outside of those spaces themselves. And so those spaces couldn't tell us something about general universal worth, but also general universal understanding. Things that were meant to have general universal understanding couldn't tell us something about these spaces. So what I wanted to do in this book was come up with a new understanding that both theorized with a fundamental appreciation of these societies and the histories of these societies, but without verifying them out of common general understanding. So I went to the archives, and unsurprisingly, most of the legal history of countries like Nigeria is not in Nigeria, or in South Africa, or in Cameroon, or in Benin. It's in London, right? It's in the National Archives, so that's already a problem. But in any case, you find in the archives something that testifies to this general understanding that we have, right? So we've got this understanding of a country like Mozambique. I love this quote from the 1970s that says, in Mozambique, the margin between what the law was and what it did was wide. So there, the laws had been shipped out like wine or milk. It was not only that the laws that came from Lisbon, it was not only the laws that came from Lisbon, but the lawyers. Or the legal profession consisted almost entirely of Portuguese persons who had gone out to the colony to make their fortunes. No law school existed in Mozambique until the very eve of independence, and the handful of Mozambicans who were able to think of becoming lawyers, who had the moral courage to do so, had to bear the expense of going to Portugal for years of study. All decisions concerning the operation of law in Mozambique, however great, however tiny, were ultimately taken in Lisbon. So what's the political or philosophical upshot of this? So when we go to the archives of Nigeria, we find this, we know it's going to be there, but it's still unbelievable to see the extent of the lack of participation, not just by ordinary, it's assumed that ordinary people didn't participate in the development of the legal infrastructure, but even the elite, right? So the legal structure in post-colonial societies, in many post-colonial societies, was brought in through a legislative council and an executive council, both of which were meant to be responsible for developing this legal infrastructure, and it had African elites on them. And often in the historical literature, we find this analysis of African elites as, house Negroes, basically, that were just there to buttress whatever the colonial persons there wanted. But I want to push back against this, because what I find in the actual archives is that some of them were house Negroes, but a lot of them were not. A lot of them, this was one of the few ways in which they could push back against an oppressive colonial infrastructure. So you have something like African men, this is from the February 1910 minutes of the Legislative Council, where African member Dr. Johnson proposes to the colonial government that it ought to be a law that a man convicted of manslaughter should be allowed continuing in the government's employ. Despite the said seeming sensibility of this proposal, the colonial governor, Walter Egerton, asks him to provide a concrete case justifying the motion. He provides several cases where Europeans in the government's employ have been convicted of killing natives. The governor disputes the technicalities of these cases, and begs to leave the matter, saying, all I desire to say on this case is that I think it must be very well known to all honourable members that there is a very strict government law against employing in the government service persons convicted of serious offences. But to assent to a general motion that in no case shall a person convicted of manslaughter be further employed by the government is, I submit, going very much too far. So anyone who's familiar with British English, where British people very politely say things that blow your mind, should be familiar with the absurdity of these kinds of statements. But what does this matter to how countries like Nigeria function today? The law doesn't function. The justice systems don't function in countries like Nigeria. MSARS is not a random occurrence. It's a result of a society that fundamentally wasn't built to serve the population that it has to deal with. So one of the things I want to say is that for us to understand how law comes to be authoritative in any society, we have to take a look at something called historical participation. And this is a concept that is meant to involve both elite participation and the participation of ordinary civilians in building the legal infrastructure, in building the moral code. So when people talk about legal infrastructures, people think, oh, this has nothing to do with like the exciting part of politics, right? This has nothing to do with the everyday lives of people in these societies, except that it does. It's the fundamental way in which people in any society come together to decide how they want to live and the vision of life that they should have for themselves. So if you're interested in why your country in Africa is not functioning well, but you're not interested in how the legal structure or the legal infrastructure comes to instantiate itself, then my suggestion is that you're not actually that interested in the way or the problems that are facing that society. So what does this have to do with a general jurisprudence? Like, why shouldn't we just toss this out and say we should just be looking at how laws have come to be instantiated in these countries in order to assess why there is such a fundamental lack of justice available to most people in society today? And my answer is that this does a disservice to both of those societies and both our intellectual understanding of those societies. Because just because we've had a situation in general jurisprudence where these societies have been neglected from analysis, doesn't mean that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what we should be doing instead is combing through our historical and philosophical understanding of these societies to develop analyses that fully encapsulate them, but also are useful to the world in general. So that's what the book is trying to do. And Nigeria's, the way the legal infrastructure comes to be instituted in countries like Nigeria, at least as evidence through the archives, is the fundamental methodology at the center of the book. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the next speaker.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you for being here. I think it's a very resonating panel.
So I tweaked my title a little bit because in the broader work that it's coming out of, I initially wanted to look at, activists who were in the work of, mobilizing and trying to change the question of governing and the question of the status of Lagos. But I decided to look at individuals. So first, I want to start with this picture that we have on this slide. And this picture is from 1952, and it's a political party meeting. And at the center of it, we see the first man who was elected as the mayor of Lagos, which is Dr. Lauren. He's in the suit standing in the crowd. The exact picture of what the discussion was about is unclear, but it's a political party meeting. And if you think about, besides the meeting, it's also important to think about the moment. And I think this is going to resonate with some of the, the era of colonization, which Susan mentioned that one. So this is the moment when Nigerians were debating and thinking about how to gain self-government in British colonial. But I want us to shift our gaze from Olorunnipe and other political activists like Asikwe, and to kind of turn our attention to the anonymous spaces who are in the crowd. And basically, think about what were the kind of ideas that they were generating and developing about the kind of future that we're going to make. So these audience members are not often at the center of my analysis when it comes to articulating questions about belonging in the city's group. So instead, the stories of Nigeria tended to focus on the political parties and their leaders as the one who were determining and shaping the discussion. Yet the actors, as I'm arguing in this picture, they're not passive listeners. And these are people who not just attended these rallies, but they were actively engaged in debates that transcended the political party meetings that we see in this picture. So today what I'm going to do is talk about how everyday urban dwellers articulated and struggled to realize their competing visions for how to govern Lagos in the 1950s. And I'll explain how residents from different gender, ethnic, and indigenous backgrounds, how they answered questions about who should represent the city, who should portray its administration, and who should formulate its policies. Ultimately, what Lagos residents wanted to do was to ensure that their perspective would be represented and they would be at the center of shaping the city's future. And I'm going to argue that residents' perspective was not always dictated by their ethnic, class, gender, or indigenous background. Rather, individuals change their stances depending on the existing political and economic context. And their everyday needs were really at the center of what shaped their arguments, the positions that they took, and how those positions changed over the politics of governing Lagos. At the same time, representation was not equal. So class and gender differences mattered here in terms of how an individual was able to participate in conversations, or even when they actually did. For example, one of the things that I've really noticed in my research is that there weren't many women at this mass rally. So when you look at the picture, can you go back to the first time? So when you look at the picture, you see, it looks like there's a lot of men. But when you actually read about this mass rallies in the newspaper, they're barely mentioning names of women who are actually at these rallies. So it's very important for us not just to think about the question of how representation happened, it's also about how the documentary sources, the archive itself, reflect this, the ideas of people who are at this debate. And so, the social history approach that going back to this gender question, and this is also the second part of my presentation, not just thinking about the ways in which urban dwellers participating in their stances, but also thinking about the way that women from different backgrounds were trying to represent their perspective, even past colonial institution, and the documentary sources excluded them. So the social history approach that I'm adopting here is not necessarily unique to my work in Lagos. It's very prevalent in the historiography on Africa, especially within the historiography of gender nationalism. So we have historians like Elizabeth Smith and Byfield, whose work have really shown us that ethnicity, gender, and class inform the popularization of the nationalist movement and also helps us to understand the ways in which Black male elites reproduce gender inequality while they were demanding independence. But what makes my approach different here is that I'm less focused on studying urban dwellers' contribution to building political parties or showing how cities function as sites of anti-colonial agitation. Rather, I'm much more invested in showing how city residents engage with questions of the city's place and status rather than that of the nation within this debate. Most importantly, I want us to understand the exchanges that are happening among Lagos residents, among each other, as well as with the politicians, and how their perspective helps us think about
their role in the process of Lagos's transformation during the end of former colonial rule. So even though ordinary people's perspective did not always inform what policymakers did, but it also helps us to shift our focus and attention in terms of really understanding what the residents' own political agenda and experiences were. So the presentation has two parts. First, I'm going to explain how and why Lagosians were demanding to be represented in the first place. And this has to do with the nation colonial governments. And second, I'm going to sort of focus on one woman during Nigeria's journey towards independence, and then explain the exchanges that residents were having in the country. So, the second slide. So the slide, the hierarchy chart that I have here, helps us to understand how colonial rule worked. And it also helps us to understand, why Lagosians were struggling with the question of self-determination in the first place. So I didn't necessarily include all of the groups that were in Lagos who were competing for power, and I'm happy to answer that question in the Q&A because it's a lot of different competing perspectives. But I'm only going to focus and gesture to the women, the Black resident chiefs. So the idea that colonial will work in a very gendered manner, it's not necessarily a new thing that I'm coming up with. And one of the leading scholars who made this claim, especially within the discourse of Lagos, is that of because Haderito and Abusede George, as well as the work of Imba. And one of the things that the scholars have really helped us to understand is that even though colonial rule marginalized the citizens of the city, there are ways in which they try to reposition themselves, especially that of women within this debate. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind in terms of how colonial rule worked is that it worked in the British imposed a direct foreign policy, which meant that the indigenous rulers who had governed the island before colonial position in the 19th century, they essentially were excluded from institutions like the Lagos Town Council, which the British used as a means of imposing its public health laws. And so you have the Commissioner of Colony was kind of like the middleman between the British governor and the rest of the population. So individuals could write petitions to the Commissioner of Colony, which would then pass them to the governor, and in some cases pass them to the various Secretary of State in London. And so, but one of the things that's peculiar about the Lagos Town Council in terms of how it works in a very gendered manner is that by 1923, you actually have very selective elective representation that was given to Black male political elites. And this for people who were property owners, and this is where class comes in here. Because for many years in Lagos, the only people who could actually vote were the people who owned property. Male tenants could not vote until 1941. And so you also have the chiefs whose relationship to the colonial was very different, unlike what we see in the context of the election. So now, and for Lagos women, on the other hand, they could not vote until 1950. And again, this phenomenon is not unique to Lagos here because the general nature of colonial rule was to marginalize, not just all Africans, but marginalized women in a very specific way. And this is where it comes on the nature of Lagos Town Council. So I want to discuss briefly in terms of like how Lagos women confronted their marginalization. Next slide, please. So on the slides, we have really three influential figures in electoral politics before the 1950s in Lagos. So we have, Alimoto Pelumura, who was the head of the market of Lagos Women Association that represented the female traders and many women from the indigenous community. And we also have Olika Bayomi, who was reflective of the Western educated elite women in politics of Lagos. And then we also have Abamakoli, who was a descendant of formerly enslaved people from Sierra Leone who migrated to Lagos in the 19th century. And Makoli is very critical in the issue of Lagos and often referred to as the father of the nationalist movement. And the reason why I have these three people juxtaposed together is to help us to understand how Lagos women work within us as well as outside of the parties to represent their interests. As I said earlier on, Lagos women could not vote until 1950. But in the case of the Nigerian National Democratic Party, which contested elections to the Lagos Town Council, one of its major foundation in the way that it was able to function, both politically and economically, was because of the support that it gained from the Lagos Market Women Association. For example, in 1925, the Lagos Market Women Association actually registered about 1,000 of its members within the party. So even though the women couldn't vote, they supported the party through funds, as well as speaking at the rallies of the Nigerian National Democratic Party. And Malala, on the other hand, she also joined a political party, which was the Nigerian Youth Movement, established in 1948. And one of the things that's very interesting about her is that after many years of supporting the Nigerian Youth Movement, she decided to establish her own political party, known as the Nigerian Women's Party. So she didn't necessarily leave the Nigerian youth movement, but she formed a different party, which was really trying to push the question of women's representation, put it at the center of the political discourse. So in 1944, she was appointed as the first woman on the Lagos Town Council. Again, this was before women could actually gain, before women gained the right to vote in 1950. So what's really critical here is that for these women, they not only challenge their marginalization, but they also use political parties. They collaborated with Black political parties, and they still criticize them for denigrating women's political representation. And they continue to use this tactic of working within as well as outside of the political party and forming their own organization, even during the 1950s, where we have an era of the mass of the Nationalist Party and mass election. So now I'm going to turn to some of the debates about Lagos's future within Nigeria's constitution. One of the things that's very critical here, and one of the reasons why I put this picture up, has to do with the third contest. Has to do with the actors who are present here. So all of the four people that we see here, this is the British Secretary of State, the three leaders who were sort of the often imagined that we see as the face of Nigeria's independence, and also the ruling parties, they were the ones who were determining and shaping the context and the place of Lagos within Nigeria's constitution. Again, we have the black, and I'm not trying to like conflict or say that their views are similar, but it helps us to see, the ways in which policy making work, in the sense of the fact that how ordinary people were not part of this decision. So the notion of Lagos stands alone or Lagos belongs to the West. These are the two options that Nigerians were debating when it comes to the context of what Lagos' future was going to look like. The notion of Lagos stands alone, and alone in this case, which is very interesting, doesn't necessarily mean total independence. It meant Lagos being the capital of federal Nigeria. And Lagos belongs to the West comes from the idea that Lagos should be integrated into the territory of the Western region and governed as a federal capital as well as a territory of the Western region. And this arrangement of Lagos being in the West did occur between 1951 and 1953. But at the Constitutional Conference in 1953, finally, the British Secretary of State decided to remove Lagos from the Western region and establish it as a federal capital. And the 1953 conference is not just important for Lagos, it was also important for Nigeria, because this was a moment when Nigeria created a federal constitution, gave more autonomy to the regions, and this kind of also set the pace for what, and it gave the regions the ability to determine when they would be independent. So this is very critical in terms of Nigeria's transition. So, and in terms of why this decision was made, a lot of stories have written about this. But all of the people involved, they did make decisions that helped them to shape their own political and economic interests. So I'm going to move on to the debate in terms of what it looks like on the ground. And this is really what's been missing and what is not often taken into consideration. So I'm going to, one of the things that I do want to say or emphasize is that the newspapers that I use were controlled by the political parties. But one of the things that is important for us to understand is that even though the political parties control the newspaper, we still need to understand how individuals frame their own reasons for why they would support Lagos's, whether or not it would be a capital or whether it would belong to the West. So I'm going to read an excerpt from one of the newspaper articles that was submitted to the Daily Service, which was owned by Ashley. Yeah, right here. So the article reads as follows. This is an excerpt from a letter that was written to the newspaper. It says, quote, "My heart dropped when I heard some Lagos women singing at the top of their voices that they thank God that Lagos was no more under Ibadan, and Ibadan here being the capital of the Western region. These people have been miseducated on the issue of Lagos. They have not been told that they're not only cut away from Ibadan, but also from the rest of the Western region. Have they been taught to know the fragmentation of the Yoruba tribe does not help us?" So one of the things, one of the reasons why this book resonated with me so much has to do with how it helps us to understand what the individual states look like and this person's personal investment in this debate. The notion, the way it describes his reaction is from a very emotional perspective. And this is not just a debate between among the political parties. This is how an individual is reacting to how other citizens, in this case, what he calls the Lagos women, responded to the decision that Lagos should be removed from the Western region. And the name itself, in this case, Bola implies as a Yoruba person, is anonymous. And because Yoruba names are often gendered, we don't know if it's a man or woman. But one of the things that's important is because for many letter writers to the newspapers, many of them were men because of the high literacy among men. But at the same time, one of the things I also want to emphasize is that Bola helps us to understand the kind of debates that were happening among the residents that transcended what the political parties were saying. So now I want to kind of like tease out who these women were that he was talking about. Yes. So the women that Ola was talking about were actually Yoruba women from the Nigerian National Democratic Party, and who were also part of the Lagos Market Women Association. Again, this was not a monolithic group. You have a faction of the Lagos Market Women Association that continued to work with the Nigerian National Democratic Party and supporting the idea of Lagos being Lagos and Western region. And one of the things that's also important here is how they were articulating their voices. Because in this newspaper article that I have here, and many of the articles that I've analyzed, it barely even mentioned that women were present in this debate. But here we actually have street conversation being brought into print and being kind of analyzed, and you have this exchange among citizens. And another thing about it is the use of the songs, right? Because many of the women were not literate in English, so the songs becomes a way in which they are participating in this debate. And again, they're singing the song of like Lagos is outside, and outside in this case means outside of the Western region. And so another thing that I want to emphasize about why those women really privileged the notion of Lagos standing alone had to do with their preference for having a much stronger and independent legal standing. In this case, a stronger local government that regulated every part of their life, rather than Lagos being governed within the Western region, which they saw as an external force. In this case, the everyday needs drove their motivation and their reasons for why they supported Lagos being outside of the Western region, and not just determined by their political. So I'm going to conclude by going back to this picture that I had earlier on. So the goal of my presentation is to show that the debates among the urban dwellers cannot be homogenized. They're not sharing the same perspective. At the same time, these are perspectives that are understudied in the context of the organization. And the exchange between Bola and NNDP, it helps us to see an example of the disagreement and debates that will unfold beyond the political parties in the streets and in the newspaper. And again, the goal of my presentation is to show that urban dwellers engaging in the process of decolonization entail more than demanding self-rule and contributing to independent state nation building projects. But this was very objective, and many people were oriented towards shaping the city's political future. And most importantly, this representation was occurring in a very genuine manner. Because the women that I discussed it would not send in letters to the newspaper editor, but they were working with the political parties and using some as a means of engaging with this debate. At the same time, this was not a monolithic group because it took very competing stances. And by looking at this debate, it can actually shift and help us change our understanding of what actually happened when it comes to the story of Lagos transition and how citizens will try to make sure that their everyday issues are met. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we're now going to branch onto Zoom to hear from Habib Sani. Habib, I hope you can hear me. Perhaps we'll move to our fifth speaker and come back later on and see if Habib is available then. So if we move straight to Daniel, thank you.
So today I'm going to be speaking of what my book which is currently entitled Die on the Sons of Empire. And so basically, my presentation and paper that is ongoing examines the history of everyday African employees of the colonial administration in Nigeria from 1900 to 1960. And my paper basically explores politics of compassionate gratuity in the colonial public sector, and my specific focus is on the junior workers, so the messengers, the shopkeepers, the janitors, etc., who died in active service, active service, and the challenges faced by their dependents when they petitioned the colonial government for the payment of compassionate gratuity. So in colonial Nigeria, compassionate gratuities were paid at the mercy of the government to dependents of workers who did not hold pensionable arrangements. So, so the central question that I'm asking, and I provided a summary slide in the interest of time so that you can see everything that I'm doing whilst I go on. So the central question that I'm asking is, what's the worth of the dead colonial African worker? And I'm making the claim that the extent to which the colonial government sometimes went to determine eligibility for and the limits of compassion signified the capacity of the states to define which colonial worker matter or did not matter, even death. And the main contribution of the modest contribution that this particular paper would make to the wider African labor history literature would be to demonstrate that industrial relations in colonial Africa did not end when African employees retired or they're out. And so this is the entire summary of the presentation. You're going to hear me say, or this line as I proceed. So these audiences will actually familiar the Nigerian labor history literature. So I'm not going to involve in the review, but it's sufficing to note that the historiography of colonial Nigerian workers has been going since the 1950s. Scholars have researched recruitment and conscription practices, wages and other types of employment, questions of discipline and punishment, labor productivity, and in some cases, the post-retirement life of African employees of empire, particularly the ex-servicemen. So my project builds on that literature by exploring the afterlife of everyday workers of the British administration that died active service. And so in this paper, I'm contending that the history of industrial relations between the colonial government and African workers doesn't end at retirement or even death. And I'm making this claim because of my systematic analysis of about 1,000 individual level archival records of compassionate gratuities paid to families of dead Nigerian workers. These files are available at the branch of the Nigerian National Archives. So from a conceptual perspective, I am proposing that the policies of compassionate gratuity in colonial Nigeria resembles a kind of necropolitics in which the state reserved the capacity to quantify and monetize the worth of the dead African worker. The concept of necropolitics was popularized by the Cameroonian historian and philosopher Achille in an article in 2003 and the 2019 book. So in chapter 3 of that book, he makes the claim that I quoted above, that the ultimate expression of sovereignty resides in the capacity of the states to determine who lives and dies. And this extreme definition of sovereignty is also derived from Foucault's biopower, right? But Mbembe codifies his definition of necropolitics after the Latin etymology of necropolis, corpse, while the expression and practice of necropolitics in the modern state is subject to debate, fewer observers will doubt that the European powers exercised control over mortality in Africa from the era of the transatlantic slave trade to the end of the Second World War. And although I'm a historian and not a theorist, my reflection on this compassionate gratuity project reveals that Mbembe's necropolitics could be stretched beyond the ability of the states to determine who lives and who dies. So with my narrow focus on Nigeria, I would like to propose that even in death, the colonial administration reserved the rights to quantify and monetize workers' corpses. So generally speaking, research in Nigerian needs to do a job, particularly Nigeria, so has established that the British government operated a flexible labor policy in the Nigerian civil service that was interpreted or changed to suit varying circumstances. So similarly, although there were guidelines in the labor policies and the labor ordinances, there were guidelines for the payment of compassionate gratuities, but these guidelines were not always followed. And important matters such as the categories of staff who were qualified for ex-gratia payments, the requirements they must have fulfilled while they were alive, or the value of the payment in relation to their last monthly or annual income were assessed on a case-by-case basis. So dependents of workers were at the mercy of the governor or its administrative delegates. So I'll describe my source now in detail. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yeah, thank you. So there are over 1,000 individual files on the payment of compassionate gratuity, as I've mentioned. And although I'm mostly interested in the payment of gratuity, the files actually provide a great deal of insight into all the aspects of socioeconomic conditions of junior colonial workers who did not hold pensionable positions in the Nigerian civil service. So as a result, the files have the potential to actually further expand our knowledge of the history beyond the narrow focus that my own narrow focus today, especially because the colonial government is the largest and most prestigious employer of labor in colonial Nigeria, things about it as well. So each file is highly detailed, including two categories of information. Category one, information about the deceased worker. The second category is information about the petition as well. So we're told the name of the dead workers, their hometown, the date they were employed and died, where they worked, their roles, their years of service, the last salary and the number of queries received or good conduct badges won, whether they served in either of the two world wars, and whether they were decorated with service members, the number of wives, children, and other direct extended families they had. The colonial workers were mostly men, and so they were the breadwinners of their family, which is a reality consistent with both narratives of the African people question, right? That's a very friendly question. So second, we learn about the life story of the petitioners, who were typically wives or adults, children, or in some cases siblings of the dead worker. So because petitions were decided on a case-by-case basis, dependents often had to appeal to pity. Their letters convey the emotional burden of losing a loved one. They talk about their precarious sources of livelihood and their financial reliance on the deceased worker. And if applicable, they highlight the educational status of younger children. The main petitioners had little or no Western education, so their letters are either handwritten or typed by professional letter writers or in English platform. So while the files are from the Commissioner of the Colonies in Lagos, the individuals involved from the dead workers to their family members reflect Nigeria's ethnic diversity. Since Lagos was the center of colonial activities. So each file, as I mentioned, typically begins with a petition to the government by family members, and I'll use two stories to illustrate what I'm saying. The adjudication process and decisions were very based on kind of investigations required or for bureaucratic reasons. As a result, the number of pages often range from 5 to 20 for each file in the archives. Based on how much the extent to which the government trusts the petitioner and the extent of the government's compassion. So in one instance, so the first on the side, in one instance involving Juan Anjania, who died in 2016, 1914. He was a messenger in the Nigerian Secretariat. He had served meritoriously for 23 years, winning multiple character badges and long service medals. The payment of his last month's salary, so the month of salary of the month in which he died, was what the government accorded to family members. Nothing else was done, despite multiple handwritten and thumb-printed follow-up letters from his two wives. And Ajayi Ado's story represents about 50% of the records, where the government just decides through the Accountant General's office to pay the last salary and nothing further. And that's how the government decided most cases. In other cases where the government was feeling compassionate, additional steps often included a police investigation to confirm that the petitioners were indeed relatives of the deceased. After the government is satisfied that a claim is genuine, an arbitrary amount, typically in multiples of the last salary, is decided and awarded either as a lump sum or in installments to the family. So that's the process. There is no methodology to that process. Sometimes the government took compassion or had compassion of petitions involving finance. The years of service don't count, as Ajayi's case represents in both for 24 years. In Ajayi's case, in fact, the dismissal of his gratuity petition did not even take into account that he fought on the side of the British Empire during the First World War, winning the 1914 to 1915 star, the British War Medal, Victory Medal. So in other cases where ex gratia payments were awarded, they came with ridiculous conditions. I'm using another example here, which is on the extreme. So there is this curious case of internal deportation involving the widow of Jacob Ajinozo, who worked as a machinist, physical machinist at the Nigerian Railway. He served for 12 years before dying unexpectedly in December 1989. The widow, Veronica, employed a lawyer to help pursue the gratuity claim. After police investigations, the government awarded an unstated sum, so the amount awarded was not one, but they attached a condition that the widow and a 5-year-old daughter was in Lagos. So despite having lived in Lagos for 12 years, they were to return to Ibuza in the district of Southeastern Nigeria, which is very versatile time. And in fact, they were offered free transportation to Lagos. And about 80% of the gratuity was withheld until confirmation was received from the district officer of Ibuza that Veronica was granted. So that's an extra concern. Right? So you have, on the one hand, stories in which the government will not take into account anything else. We just have one of the last month's salary. And in area of stream, like in this case, you have the case of internet competitions, and there are numerous gray areas in between that are going to pursue in the global national history. But basically to reiterate the argument I'm trying to make, it's that the extent to which the Union government, the files, the over 1,000 individual level files of compassionate gratuity the Nigerian archives clearly demonstrates that the Union government had the power to regulate the lives of dead African workers and the independence into that government. And because of the level of involvement in politics of compassionate gratuity, the level of police investigation involved, multiple interviews with family members, it sort of signified the capacity of the state to determine which will work on that. And one quick point that I should make is that employing a lawyer did not matter in the outcome of the petition, whether they would have followed that or not. It was the process was really arbitrary because I was trying to sort of systematically analyze the past and sort of arrange them in the order in which the case to resolve that became possible because it was just based on how the commission of the government can take it with feeling and everybody's outside. And because colonial workers were not only typically breadwinners in their families, each of them consisted of as many as 15 minors and adult relatives. So the policies of compassionate gratuity helps or enables such dead workers to each dead worker to serve as an interface between their unemployed or self-employed dependent animal. So we tend to learn even more about colonial labor history and being able to study the life stories of dependents of dead workers. And we're also able to see that the resolution of each gratuity case therefore had a real impact on the standard of living of family members, from feeding, housing to education. And each case, each individual file sort of served as a micro level opportunity to examine the relationships of the government, the wider public, and ultimately enriches our knowledge of the African people history.
How can they go at contacting people?
Hello, sir. It was, yes.
Yeah, okay. I do think we're going to get a free to leave, unfortunately, today. So I'm going to kind of close the presentation part of the session and then open the floor to questions as well. So thank you to all of our presenters today for a series of fascinating papers for different aspects of the social history of Lagos. And do we have any questions from the floor? I mean, while people are thinking of their questions, I might just use my position as chair by beginning with a couple of points that I was curious about. One was in your paper. I was wondering, so when you were saying that quite a lot of literature characterized colonial elites as being essentially pliant, how far is that the case, I mean, for example, with the historiography of the legal profession in the colonial period? So perhaps just like Alex Taylor, for example, in the colonial period, were often a kind of thorn in the side of the colonial administration and had to consider that perhaps, so while there is I mean, an older kind of a characterization of elites in that way for nationalist historiography, whether in fact there's a kind of more recent social history that's challenged that. For Damilola, I think it's really interesting the kind of phenomenon of the colonial sort of government dealing with dead people as a way of controlling the living. And I was wondering if you could perhaps ideally expand on whether you consider this operates in multiple domains of colonial society, or to put it in different terms, multiple forms of colonial governmentality, or whether this is specifically to pensions. So I was thinking about, for example, ex-servicemen's announcements, for example, 1% of you made there. However, thank you very much for the. I mean, it's really interesting to look at the mobilisation of kind of women's political organisations. And I was wondering if you can kind of whether you consider this as something that's specific to the 20th century, whether you trace this in the 19th century as well. So in the area of what Sheraton's Victorian Lagos, whether they have examples of women in powerful civil society positions effectively. And finally, for Susan, thank you for your paper as well. I was just wondering whether is the literature on, for example, African American perceptions of apartheid South Africa kind of relevant here as a kind of African American internationalist perception of domestic politics, basically. So these are the kind of questions that I had to raise. Do we have any? Oh, okay. So, Habib, if you can hear us, please do begin your presentation.
Hello.
No, okay. We're sorry, Habib seems to have technical problems, so we're just going to continue with questions from the floor. The lady in back, please.
Also, mentioned statements, you define that level of university was the expectation, how the state was, how they were able to actually selling how
how do you define it? Because you said it's also the number still says that. Like, how do you define it?
So if you want to respond and then I'll move forward and as we get more questions for what afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll start with the last question. Were you? So I draw on, so again, as I mentioned in the presentation, I'm a historian, so I don't really refer that much, but at the same time, I drew on actually I reflected politics, which is an extreme definition of sovereignty, right? Which is basically having that the lives of citizens or the lives of the Tasmania state can be sort of regulated and determined by governments, and that governments can determine what an illegal and he was drawing on by power. And I'm using this, I'm getting on this in a loose, not trying to create your I'm using it in a loose, but I'm basically making the claim that so what we know in Colombian natural history is that the colonial government sort of made the civil service to be the most prestigious place where you can work. So if you work for them, it's more like you were out of elite workers, it's elite workers in society. And so everything tied to that, just from I would say this is your salaries and abilities to go leave or not, which is determining broader region of discipline, question of discipline, question of queries, the question of promotion, the question of how much you get your hand, compared to the question of how much a woman, female worker earns compared to the other, all of those things are what I bring into that same call, like the ability of capacity of the state to determine sort of the worth of the living work. But then I'm stretching that beyond the by saying that by determining how much to award to the dependence on the dead work. It also involves, it also sort of stretches the realms of capacity in ability beyond just everyday administration of work and make administration of labor bodies into determining the worth of the value of dead. So that's basically what I'm saying. So I'm not trying to build a theory out of situations. Then there was a first, there was an initial question. Sorry.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, what I was basically simply saying that I thought was an interesting phenomenon. So I guess if you've prompted me into pushing this, I would say I think this account sovereignty colleague is a worker from the Joris Paul Schmidt, who has been criticised in different contexts, including this particular influence in this idea for having a very extreme idea of the capacity of the state, which becomes even more questionable potentially in the context of colonial Africa, because one of the dangers of this model is that you end up with an overestimation of the ability of colonial officials to coerce through politics that's term everyday life.
Sure, to respond to that, there are like studies of self-oppression, studies about workers who are senior elements of gene, so I couldn't also not like sure to be like so I guess I have to say these things and how I actually but it's easier to vary about information. About reading that's looking back and that generate questions like this, but I can't do so don't say this kind of stuff. Then yeah, you asked a question initially about whether
But you could not see the law.
yeah, and I'll say that because the files came from the Office of the Commissioner of the Court, naturally the files were for members of the citizens. So if I want to see whether the second is I'm here to say Clinton, or I would have to check the files of the files of military files, which roughly that I can see. I mean, I actually just talked about on this files while I was That's a to achieve very well as well. Right, I was just saying billable files and okay. Can I do this? Literally, and I requested and I got someone to judge it. This kind of thing I did story to be put together. So the ties nicely what I was waiting for. Whether or not we make the case that is an all level of administration in Nigeria or that stretching for beyond Nigeria is a story that's yet to be told.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? The gentleman from this.
Hello. No, if you can take me.
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me now.
Yeah, we've been taking questions from the floor, so we're in the middle of the gentleman asking a question. So I'm going to get him to finish his question, and then we will try to come back to you after that. So if you just bear with us for a few minutes, please.
Okay. Thank you.
Very short answer. It's actually not the short. First, this is the two-party approach hierarchy and then with an entry file processes. The first part is to say, if you're familiar with HCC education in Nigeria, particularly Southwestern Nigeria, you know that Nigerians are part of the colonial elitist within the establishment since the mid-19th, well, since the 1870s as well. Besides, also, for instance, and escapes me. And you can just man as well. We learned from their work that Nigerians can be effective. No stuff in there, like most of the lawyers are Nigerians, most of the lawyers are doctors Nigerians, and in fact, they don't necessarily don't think about things because they best and white counterparts. That's good. So from the 1870s onwards, we have Nigerians who were Oxford. So it's in that sense. So Lagos represents is for that, but also free town. But Western wouldn't really try the same case and the system Africa or South America for the 19th century, but the 19th century change. So I'm trying to make so if you take that as the first answer to your question, then you know that Nigerians will eventually yes, they don't. And what this paper enables you to do is to sort of see sort of carefully understand. So what about those who are in non-pension issues? What about those who are precariously employed? What about those who use education products that are require any education? Employment don't require any education, etc. And but as far as the determination of payments is concerned, even though the bodies are decided to get the investigations sometimes with Nigerians, but the letters were ultimately signed by the GO police. I mean, Nigerians are decided as civil police. As late as the 1890s, there was a high HMU by so you have Nigerians like 7 civil police, but this period that I see was and ultimately during the process of investigation of Nigeria.
Okay, so we're going to try and go back to Habib. Habib, can you hear now?
Thank you.
Okay, if you can
Good
speak, sorry,
evening.
if you can speak for 10 minutes, please, because we're running out of time at this point. So please keep it to exactly 10
Okay.
minutes.
Okay,
Yeah, go for
I
it.
will try to do that. Yeah, the title of my paper is Indigenous Settlers Conundrum. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
The title of my paper is Indigenous Settlers Conundrum and the 2023 general elections in Lagos State. And I'm looking at this from the historical perspective. Yeah, Indigenous Settler Conundrum in Lagos, Nigeria has been a recurring theme. That's my introduction. I've been a recurring theme in the political landscape, particularly during the presidential election. My article seeks to look at comprehensive exploration of the historical roots and the implications of the indigenous settler dynamics within the context of presidential election held in Lagos recently. I want to look at the historical context, the presidential election and identity politics, then the necessary challenges and implications, and I will do a conclusion without wasting so much time. Yes, when we look at Lagos carefully, we discover that it has been a center or a convergence of indigenous communities, which began with the settlement of some individuals that are generally referred to as Awori, and to some extent others known as Eko, who cohabited pari passu over the time. And with time, when various factors led to the coming of the Benin into Lagos, Lagos became known not just as a Awori community alone, but also a Benin Awori speaking people. In fact, this was well enunciated by Bishop Ajayi Crowder when he referred to the language spoken by the people as Benin Awori language. However, by the beginning of the 19th century, a lot of factors came into play, leading to the movement of other people, not only from what we can refer to as intra-Nigeria migration, but also international migration. And we can look at the abolition of slave trade as a major factor in this. From around the 1830s, a lot of people, aside from the Awori and the indigenous Eko people, moved into Lagos and increased the population of the area, such that we had both the returnees from Salon, who were rescued by the British squadron ship and were brought into Badagry, and some of them found their way back into Lagos, where they were taken out in the first instance. Then we have those who were emancipados, people of Afro-Brazilian community who also returned to Lagos. And so by the end of the 19th century, the population of Lagos is clear, and we can see that it consists of what Otumba Payne referred to as ethnic analysis of the population of Lagos. And this consists of Lagos or Eko tribe that was about 20,221, constituting about 23.6% of the population, followed by the Popo or Ogu speaking people. We have the Oyo, we have the Ijebu, we have the Egba, we still have the Awori, then we have the Jesha, Egbado, Nupe, etc., including crewmen, the people of Liberia, and others. So by 1893, the population of Lagos consisted of so many people from both people of Lagos and those of the hinterland, as well as people who were returned into Lagos as the aftermath of the slave trade. So between 1914 to 1950, the population of Lagos and the politics of Lagos society was determined by people who constituted mainly this what we can refer to as educated elite, and some traditional elements in Lagos society who were involved first in the water registration of 1908, and this continued until around 1940 when the British tried to introduce a system of mayoralty into Lagos. By the 1950, when the mayoral election was contested, there were about one quarter of indigenous elements in the Lagos Town Council, while the others were represented by people of different origins. In fact, the first mayor of Lagos, Ibiyinka Olorunimbe, had an Igbo man as his deputy. And so from that period until, let's say, the period of the military incursion into the Nigerian politics in the post-independence era, there was a kind of movement, or what we can refer to as crystallization of identity politics in the electoral area. And indigeneity became a major defining factor, for political representation and resource allocation in the electoral calculus. So what are we trying to put forward there? That all of the people that moved into Lagos continued to play an important role in the Lagos politics. We can identify two of these categories. One are the people of Yoruba origin from Western Nigeria who have been at the vanguard of political agitation since that time that I mentioned in 1908 and up till 1950s and beyond. Then the second category of people who, although did not have a serious presence based on the analysis of Lagos population I mentioned earlier, began to play important role in the politics of Lagos, especially by acquiring land in different parts of Lagos. And by 1999, when we started the Fourth Republic, they have constituted a major force in the political arena to the extent that they also were considered in the sharing of political offices in Lagos. And we can see from the era of the present president of Nigeria, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, some of these people, they were doing political positions in the Lagos cabinet. And
Because of the discrepancy in the civil service and the public service and the agencies and where the funding is coming from, whether it's donor funding or direct federal government funding or it's public partnership. So I don't know where it's going. I cannot say, but at least I can lay out just I've done. I can describe what is obtainable at present and what was obtainable in the past and sort of allow you or any other interested party to draw their own conclusions. Thank you.
Yes. So I'm curious to know if there are cases of skilled workers.
Pardon?
Skilled workers. And maybe issues of the civil war and
Alpha.
Which is why, so I think that's another really for those who are interested in that.
Hello.
Yeah, I was just trying to get multiple questions for another man.
Ask us a question. So you had asked us a question before.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
I mean, I just want to like piggyback on the comment I was given that before the director's comment, I understand the published the amount of question that was offered that I was like, right, to what extent, you know, what has clarity of the differences between how the vote would compensated workers as part of the level of business. But I just wanted to sort of respond to your question in the sense of the fact that, you know, the question of like women's political presence or representation as opposed to in the case, and with the nature of the women would not really change in terms of like how women were placed in the bottom of when it comes to representation, power. And one of the things that's also important here, I mean, we could think about the 19th century as another example of that in terms of like women and I talk about what's educated women that were discussing, you know, this men's, which Darren mentioned earlier, issues of participation in social clubs, religious clubs, you know, signing petitions. So you do see those type of examples of women representation. And you also have a case whereby you have an attempt of mass mobilization in 1908 with protest against the imposition of a water rate tax. And one of the things, I mean, the same idea that I'm applying in my 20th century case can also be, I mean, the later part of the 20th century 40s can be applied in this case in the sense of the fact that you also have a video, you know, women who were water senators saying that if, you know, the water grid tax were charged, then they would run out of business. So that's why it's important to kind of think about the differences between the opinion of the individual versus the group, which is kind of like the point that I was trying to make.
Response to the question. So I would say that the historiography of African Americans engaging with outside South Africans, which the very ideals of African was very deep innovation with this strong against racial segregation. And Africa itself was exactly that. But we find that the engagement of African Americans in South Africa, at least before the mid-1960s, for the time to first for that date, and it's also COVID from the itself. But it would increase the early part of the 70s of the 20th century. The Congress and state states, we find that's the engagement between and South Africa.
Yeah, thanks. So I think you're right. You know, recent literature does push back against this understanding that people, both lawyers and other members of this were not just online. There were some who were, but I guess I want to me, it doesn't matter that much because I want to try and understand what the patterns are that give us a general understanding than just this person did this and this person didn't do this. What I want to say is that even those who weren't compliant, for a conceptual understanding, this level of participation was below minimum, right? Because it doesn't actually get to influencing what the laws look like and what the legal structure looks like as something that embodies the actual population itself, right? It's still just an import of British law. I mean, and it's still there today. If you go to any law court in Nigeria, they're all dressed up like they're in London. It's bizarre, right? This is how many years after independence. And you know, if you speak to any Nigerian lawyer, a lot of the laws are still laws that date to British laws, and even the ones, you know, the ones that the great legal and Nigerian scholars makes it so clear that, you know, even the laws that have become Nigerian laws are not laws that were created by Nigerians themselves. It's just a technical legal understanding by which British laws were transmutated to the legal code, right? So this understanding of the legal system is something that is really part and parcel of how a society understands itself. Doesn't exist in most African countries, and I think in most post-colonial societies, yeah, the law is not in the service of justice, and that shouldn't be surprising. But I just had a question to add to all the many questions for your fantastic presentation in your paper. As I say, my philosophy theorist is that I'm not. So it's super interesting because I'm not convinced that Mbembe's understanding of sovereignty is that extreme, right? Because it's embedded in most understandings of sovereignty. The very understanding of sovereignty is the monopoly over the use of violence, incorporates this understanding. You can live without it. But and if it's not that, so if it's not that extreme, then what I guess I want to understand is what you're saying in this extension, that the colonial state, through a lot of what you're finding, a lot of these things that you're finding, is exerting the power not just over who gets to live and die in a specific moment, but who gets to have memories of it as well, right? Because people, the control over death doesn't end with the death, right? It goes on into who is allowed to remember you through the works of your attention, which all the things you did when you were alive. And so the extension could be that, right? That it's not just a pause for who gets to live, but who actually get to have their memories keep, you know, living. But I'm just not convinced that the Mbembe's definition is that extreme that he would like us to take it.
No. Yes, that's a reflection of my university area of the other one. I would really receive that to explore also.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists today. Fascinating papers, debate, discussion. Thank you for your questions as well. The other legal studies panel later on in the day. Thank you, everyone.
I know.
End is not. Why are you waiting? You said I should wait to them. Oh, as per, but why is this still recording?
Before you shut.